Dirty Bird podcast contains foul language and is not appropriate for young fledglings. Listener discretion is advised. Our intro music is brought to you by Ricky Pistone, aka Dick Piston, and our outro music is brought to you by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music.
Are you looking for a podcast today with ornithology and humor you crave? Well, I know of these guys and it's birds they like. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're just a couple guys who really like birds. It's Dirty Bird, yeah, they're pretty dirty, but they really like birds.
Hello, and welcome to Dirty Bird, a podcast that tells you everything you need to know about an individual bird species with a laid-back atmosphere. Today's bird is a bit rarer than the more common North American species I usually cover, but if you're in a pine forest in the eastern U.S. and you hear what sounds like a dog's squeaky toy, you've just discovered a brown-headed nuthatch. Its cousin, the white-breasted nuthatch, is much more widespread and well-known, and while the brown-headed shares a lot of traits with the white-breasted, they have a personality of their own, which makes them a delight to observe. So join me in this episode as I describe the brown-headed nuthatch, talk about its evolutionary history, and bring up some surprising facts about the intelligence of this little bird. We also have a return to the podcast of Punchy Joe, a crowd favorite, and he talks about his experiences with brown-headed nuthatches on his property. So crack a beer, grab your binoculars, and let's learn about a new bird together. I'm recording right now, sitting next to Ackerson Creek, which you can probably hear burbling and bubbling behind me. It's a creek that flows eventually into Laurel Creek, a large creek in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. Now, where I'm recording from right now doesn't have brown-headed nuthatches. However, the Cherokee do have some stories about nuthatches, which I'll bring up in the end of this episode. The genus species name of the brown-headed nuthatch is Sitta pusilla. Now, Sitta is the only genus of nuthatches in the family Sittidae. There's just one genus in that family. And it was formalized by Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish scientist who invented the binomial scientific naming system that we have today. Sitta was ancient Greek for nuthatch. Pusilla is Latin for very small, and these are very small birds. They're only about 3 to 4 inches, but a lot is packed into that tiny body and brain, as we'll get into later in the episode. So the description of what this little brown-headed nuthatch looks like: it has a blue-gray body with a white underbelly, kind of similar to the white-breasted nuthatch, but it has a distinct brown cap. And it also has a very short tail. It has a chisel-like bill, which is nearly a quarter the size of its whole body. And to see a great picture on what these guys look like, check out the Dirty Bird Instagram and Facebook page at Dirty Bird Podcast, and you'll see a picture from Jess. Also goes by the Instagram name Coastal VA Wild. If you guys aren't following her yet, please follow her. She has some amazing bird posts. She's based out of Gloucester, Virginia, and has some amazing picture of the birds of that area. And she caught a picture of a brown-headed nuthatch, which you'll see on her Instagram and Facebook page. The behavior of these guys, they're seen most often walking every which way on a tree. Nuthatches tend to walk down trees head first. It helps you tell them apart from woodpeckers and tree creepers, which often go up trees, whereas nuthatches, you'll see them going down trees, they'll be going sideways, they're going everywhere. Brown-headed nuthatches especially like to hang upside down on the underside of pine tree limbs on trees. Nuthatches also have large feet in proportion to their body. Unlike woodpeckers, they don't use their tail feathers to prop themselves up on trees. Rather, they rely on their strong feet to grab onto the bark. These brown-headed nuthatches, because of their small size, their brown cap, they kind of blend in with pine trees, and they also have a habit of feeding high up in the canopy of pine trees. So they can be very difficult to see. However, they're unmistakable when you hear that rubber ducky squeak call. As far as predators for these guys, they're most vulnerable when they're nesting. They nest in cavities like all nuthatches. Their cavities are generally only 7 to 10 feet off the ground, though, which makes it easy for snakes, raccoons, possums, squirrels, and cats to get at them. Females are especially very prone to predation. A lot of researchers, they'll talk about how when they go to look at these guys, they don't flush easily from the nest. A lot of other birds, woodpeckers, titmice, chickadees, you'll go and look in their nest and the mom will fly away immediately, and then you get a good look at the eggs and the young. However, brown-headed nuthatches do not run away. They'll just stay there and kind of look at you, and I assume if you're trying to eat their eggs, and they might try to fight back. This is thought to be due to the small egg size. Their eggs are like only about the size of a marble. John James Audubon compared them to hummingbird eggs. So they're prime food for lots of things. Lizards love to eat them, small mammals. And so mom might not flush very easily, so she can fight off these, little lizard that's coming and trying to eat her eggs. Other cavity nesting birds may also try to steal brown-headed nuthatch cavities, so it's important that the mom won't flush and run away so she can fight off that chickadee and be like, no, this is my home. However, being this protective comes at a cost, and so she's very prone to predation. If that's a snake that comes and slithers in and she's not running away, then I'm sorry, but she is toast. And I'll talk about brown-headed nuthatch intelligence later on, but I think their social structure and their intelligence may also factor this in. This may be me projecting a little bit, but I think that mama nuthatch really loves her eggs and her young, and she just can't fly and run away. She has to stay and fight, even if it means her death. So I'd like to read a little paragraph from my handy-dandy National Geographic Book of Birds, published in 1933. And their section on the brown-headed nuthatch, they write, average length 4 1/2 inches. These nuthatches are found principally in open forests of pine, sometimes low down near the ground, and again in the summits of the tallest pines. They travel in little flocks, being social except during the nesting season. They often scold vociferously at intruders from some high perch. If really alarmed, they hide by remaining motionless against the bark that they match so closely in color. The brown-headed nuthatch digs a nest hole in a dead stub or stump, a telephone pole, or a fence post. In the south, the birds are earnestly at work on nest cavities in February. The true brown-headed nuthatch is found from eastern Arkansas and southern Delaware to the Gulf Coast in eastern Texas. The gray-headed nuthatch, a paler race, ranges in Florida. And so they touch upon there that there are subspecies. There's kind of a main species of brown-headed nuthatch. The brown-headed nuthatch, like they say in that paragraph there, lives in the southeastern pine forests of the U.S., and kind of along the Chesapeake Bay as far north as southern Maryland. They continue down to North Carolina, South Carolina, and over to the Gulf Coast. In southern Georgia and in Florida, there's a subspecies which has a gray cap. That subspecies is called Sitta pusilla caniceps. There is also an isolated population on Bahama Island in the Bahamas, and it is referred to as Sitta pusilla insularis. These birds are non-migratory and really don't travel much from their birthplace. Their preferred habitat is loblolly, shortleaf, longleaf, and slash pine forest. Fire is an important factor for them because they like the mature pines with a clear understory and not much smaller shrubs and other plants growing on the ground. If you've ever been in a tall pine forest and the ground is just matted with pine needles and really nothing else is growing, that's what these guys love. Their population is at 1.1 million but declining. From 1966 to 2015, it declined by 24%. It's thought that logging of mature pine forests and fire suppression has contributed to this. However, there is some good news with the brown-headed nuthatch, because it's one of the few Native American birds to show success at reintroductions. It's been reintroduced successfully in Missouri at the Mark Twain National Forest and at the Jonathan Dickinson State Park near Jupiter, Florida. Populations are also expanding. It's unknown if they're reestablishing some previous areas where they were exterminated, or if they're spreading to new areas that can now support them. And a good example of this comes from the Piedmont area of Virginia. The brown-headed nuthatches were originally kind of confined to the pine forests surrounding the Chesapeake Bay and Piedmont area of Virginia, but now they're moving into more mountainous areas and counties such as Albemarle. It's thought that pines and parks or private lands with landscape mown lawns mimic the mature pine forests that they prefer. You can think about this: if you have a pine tree in your yard and you're constantly mowing around it and mowing down any shrubs or smaller plants that might grow there, you're almost mimicking a small forest fire coming through and clearing out the understory while leaving the larger trees. They also have been observed spreading to areas with man-made lakes such as Smith Mountain Lake and Lake Monticello. It's thought that a combination of access to fresh water and all the homes on the lakeshore with lawns attracted them. Also, pines tend to be planted a lot around these man-made lakes because they grow fast and they help prevent erosion. So it is great to see that populations are spreading and opening up into new areas. Granted, these are areas that were clearing of the deciduous trees that were once there and the natural environment that was once there, and created another one which the brown-headed nuthatches prefer. Also, this is only a temporary measure, because in the natural course of forests, fast-growing pines are eventually replaced by deciduous trees. And there's an example of this in Botetourt County, Virginia, where a lot of forests were cleared for farmland in the 1800s and 1900s. Then some of that farmland was left to go fallow, and pine trees began to conquer and grow on it, and brown-headed nuthatches moved in with those pine forests. However, now the pines are being replaced by deciduous trees, and brown-headed nuthatches in Botetourt County are declining. And the reason why brown-headed nuthatches like pine trees so much is their preferred food is insects that hide within the pine bark or the pine nuts themselves. They'll use their chisel-like beak to flake off pieces of bark and find bugs that are hiding under there or eggs that they've laid. They'll also use a variety of tools, usually derived from pine trees, to dig out bugs. In winter, they switch to a diet of more pine seeds than bugs, and will use tools to store and retrieve seeds. Unlike the white-breasted nuthatch, though, they don't store as many seeds. The white-breasted you'll see caching away seeds in bark and nooks and crannies all the time. However, they don't store quite as many seeds, and I think why that is because they're still able to find a lot of insect eggs during the winter because they can flake off that bark and find eggs that are kind of hidden deep in the bark, ones that white-breasted nuthatches wouldn't be able to access. In summer, they're usually seen feeding in breeding pairs only, but maybe with a few offspring or family members. In winter, they're much more gregarious, and may also be seen in mixed flocks with chickadees, woodpeckers, and pine warblers. Now, brown-headed nuthatch breeding, they are mostly monogamous and stay with a partner through the entire breeding season, and then years after that, if not for life. Pairs excavate their own nest together in soft, decaying wood. Snags, which are broken off treetops kind of hanging or tree limbs hanging, are very important for this. If they can't find suitable wood, they will use old woodpecker cavities, or they'll use a nesting box if that's available. The male will select the cavity, and then together they'll line it with feathers, cotton, twigs, and bark. It can take up to 1 to 6 weeks to make a cavity. They may go back to the same spot year after year. If they don't, they will excavate a new one, usually within 100 meters of the old. If a brown-headed nuthatch pair dies or moves off, their children may use their same nesting cavity that their parents excavated and raised them in. The female will lay 3 to 7 eggs, and it takes 14 days for them to hatch, another 17 to 19 for them to fledge. The juvenile nuthatches will be able to breed at 1 year old, at which time they'll start to develop their brown cap, a sign of their sexual maturity. Now, brown-headed nuthatch breeding is also a little bit more complicated than just one pair raising their young and going about their business. A lot of this complication has to do with their cooperative breeding strategies that exist. So cooperative breeding means that a relative or offspring or unrelated member may help raise the young along with the parent, even though they're not the direct parent. In one case I read, there was a nuthatch mom and dad who had raised a batch of kids, and then one of the males stayed behind and helped them raise their next brood. After that brood was raised, the parents disappeared, but a male nuthatch and one of the younger brothers that he had helped raise just kind of stayed in the territory and stayed together. Both of them met a female, and their babies were had, and they both helped raise the young. It's not sure who mated with who. The younger bird might have just been helping out the older brother who had mated with this female. However, interestingly, the next breeding season, the older male was gone, and the younger brother was now with the female and stayed with her and raised some more young. So I love the cooperative breeding in these guys. I really think it kind of shows their intelligence and the complexity of their social structure. Now, cooperative breeding, the advantages of it, it's almost like a trial for the young. Like, they get to practice with the parents on how to raise young so that they're more likely to be successful when they invest all their energy into raising young the next year. And then the parents get the added benefit of having someone extra around to help provide food. And they don't mind helping teach, as long as you're going to help bring some bugs to the table. Studies have shown that about 1 in every 5 pairs will do cooperative breeding each season. And it seems to occur more in years when there's a lot of offspring that survive. This may be due to less nesting cavities being available, more competition for food. Often it's a male offspring that helps the parents with the next batch of kids. Siblings have also been observed helping each other out. Usually it's only a group of 3 that will do the cooperative breeding, but it can be up to 5. Now, another sign of the intelligence of these birds is their tool use. We talked about this a little bit already. They will use tools, usually from pine trees, to help collect and store food. They're most commonly seen using a flake of pine bark to help pry off other flakes of bark from pine trees. However, they'll also use pine needles and twigs. They'll use these to kind of probe into areas. Juvenile birds will begin using tools only a few weeks post-hatching. This suggests that it is an innate behavior and is not taught. Sometimes brown-headed nuthatches will just grab a tool, use it once, and then drop it. Other times they seem to have a favorite tool that they'll use multiple times and fly from tree to tree with it. They have been observed using up to 3 tools at once during a feeding event. They'll have kind of 3 tools at the ready and try one, and then switch to another, and then switch to another until they're able to get their food. So almost like a repairman has his toolbox, they got their little toolbox of pine needle and twig and bark, and they'll try each one out until they're able to get the job done. Another aspect that shows the incredible social organization of these birds is their preening behavior. They've been observed using their bills to preen the head and neck of other brown-headed nuthatches. These areas are hard, if not impossible, for individuals to reach on their own, so they need someone to help them out. It appears to serve a function more than just hygiene, though. And its social function goes beyond just pair bonding. It's more than just a male and female scratching each other's heads going, I love you, let's make babies. Also, males and females are observed grooming juveniles, juveniles are observed grooming breeding adults, and juveniles are observed grooming each other. So there's some kind of social function going on there, we just don't know entirely what. In one case I saw, there were 2 brown-headed nuthatches grooming a third at the same time. That's a lucky nuthatch. Also, breeding males are okay with other males grooming their female. It doesn't seem to be like a sexual thing at all. Like, a male could be breeding with a female, and then another male comes over and grooms her, and he's like, I'm okay with this, it's cool. You're not trying to steal my woman. And this using tools and preening each other, it really reminds me of chimps. And we have such a high regard of chimp intelligence, but then we look at these little birds and we just think, oh, they're stupid, they're bird-brained. So there's a lot more going on, and I think it's worth considering. Now, the social structure of the brown-headed nuthatches, their small size, and their camouflage definitely helps them out because they have an annual survival rate of about 66 to 78%. This is high for a small bird. Most songbirds are only around 50 to 60%. Their choice of habitat also likely factors into this. The fact that they prefer these mature pine forests with no understory, it really gives predators very little room to hide. And so they can see something coming from far off. The longest known lifespan of a brown-headed nuthatch is 9 years. So let's talk a little bit about the evolutionary history of brown-headed nuthatches. How did these guys come to be? Why do they like pine forests? So like I said earlier, the nuthatch family Sitidae has a single genus in it, Sitta. And they're most closely related to tree creepers, wall creepers, and the New World wrens. Nuthatches first evolved and diversified in Asia. And there's kind of a few major clades of nuthatches that evolved. There's the large-bodied nuthatches. This contains the giant nuthatch of Asia and also our white-breasted nuthatch in North America. There's the nuthatches that use mud to plaster and reinforce and waterproof their cavities. There's a nuthatch called Przewalski's nuthatch of China and Tibet, and it has kind of its own clade. It evolved pretty separately from these guys. And then there's the small-bodied nuthatches, which contains several Asian nuthatch species. It also contains the pygmy nuthatch and the brown-headed nuthatch. They are, the pygmy nuthatch, brown-headed nuthatch are the most closely related. They also have a sister group with the red-breasted nuthatch, which is native to North America, and the Yunnan nuthatch of the Himalayas. The small-bodied nuthatches we're going to focus on, and they excavate their own cavities, a behavior that is not found in other nuthatches. It's thought that the common ancestor to all nuthatches did not excavate its own cavity, and that this is a new trait that evolved in this clade. Now, the scientific term for that is apomorphy. Also, the pygmy nuthatch and the brown-headed nuthatch are conifer specialists. This is not seen in most of the basal members of the nuthatch family. So it's thought that the common ancestor of the nuthatches was a generalist feeder. He didn't build his own cavity, and then this conifer speciation evolved. So our common ancestor nuthatches first evolved in Asia as a generalist feeder that did not excavate its own cavity. Then a group evolved that liked conifers a lot. Conifers tend to have less natural cavities than deciduous forest. So these conifer nuthatches began excavating their own nesting holes. 2 dispersal events happened from Asia to North America around 11 million years ago. The first was done by one of the more ancestral generalist feeding nuthatches that produced the white-breasted nuthatch we know today. The second was by one of those conifer specialists, and it produced the pygmy nuthatch and the brown-headed nuthatch. The pygmy nuthatch also does cooperative breeding, suggesting that this behavior was present in the common ancestor to both of them. The pygmy nuthatch and brown-headed were likely separated due to parapatric speciation. This means that there was one common ancestor, but they then began to occupy 2 separate niches. However, there was a hybrid zone where gene exchange occurred. Today they are more completely separated when you look at their range maps, but that's probably due to kind of glaciation events that caused them to stay in refugia. It's estimated that they split around 6 million years ago, based on BEAST analysis. BEAST analysis, it stands for Bayesian Evolutionary Analysis Sampling Trees. It uses a combination of phylogeny trees, molecular analysis, and statistics that is way over my head to predict when a species diverged. It's thought that the pygmy nuthatch and the brown-headed nuthatch have had little morphological evolution since their divergence in the early Miocene. However, the brown-headed nuthatch has experienced some interesting dispersal and speciation events in the last few thousand years. The isolated population on Grand Bahama Island demonstrates this. The Grand Bahama population of brown-headed nuthatch is conspecific with the Caribbean pine. Similar to the brown-headed nuthatch on the mainland U.S., Grand Bahama populations have been devastated by deforestation and suppression of forest fires. Also, increasingly devastating hurricanes have knocked down pine forests and have hurt the population. They now number in the hundreds to a few thousand. Their declining numbers have prompted more research into their populations, including considering it a separate species from the mainland brown-headed nuthatch. Genetic analysis has shown that the Grand Bahama population diverged from mainland around 685,000 years ago. However, Grand Bahama has been inundated by the sea multiple times during these thousands of years, most recently 125,000 years ago and 7,500 years ago. So it's kind of impossible that they would just 685,000 years ago fly from the mainland to Grand Bahama and become this separate kind of subspecies, because the sea would have risen and totally taken them out. So what gives? What's going on here? Instead of the brown-headed nuthatch colonizing Grand Bahama directly from the mainland and differentiating, it's thought that a common ancestor of the Grand Bahama brown-headed nuthatch initially colonized other areas before being isolated to that island during more recent years. This makes sense because during the glaciation periods, there would be these super islands that would form as sea level dropped in the Caribbean. And then the sea levels would rise again and populations would kind of be separated into smaller islands. And comparing the molecular analysis between Grand Bahamas and the mainland populations, the mainland population of nuthatches are all very genetically similar. And then the Grand Bahama kind of has a very different genetic signature. It appears to kind of have a slight preference for Louisiana populations of brown-headed nuthatches. So possibly that common ancestor kind of came from the Louisiana area. And the reason why mainland populations of brown-headed nuthatches are so genetically similar is because those glaciation events really caused them to be isolated to small areas of refugia. Over the period of those 6 million years that they've been a species, there's been multiple times where the glaciers have come down. There's only been tiny little valleys that they were able to survive in, and then the glaciers go back, they spread out, and the cycle kind of continues. It's only been within the past 20,000 years that they've really been able to spread out. And this is really similar to the population spread of the barred owl. Check out that episode. The Grand Bahama population also has a higher pitched and more rapid call. This evidence has led to scientists suggesting that the Grand Bahama brown-headed nuthatch be considered a separate species. This would help to elevate its conservation status and protect it from extinction. Well, I've done enough talking here. Let's listen to Punchy Joe.
Yeah, this new cord works like a charm.
Good.
This looks great. I'm getting good levels. I'm sitting here with Joe of the Osprey episode fame. This time, instead of sitting on the dock, though, we are in Joe's Airstream in his yard, and the Airstream has a nice view of the yard, a nice view of the bird fountain, the bird bath, and it's a nice place to be. Thanks for being on Dirty Bird again, Joe.
Well, thanks for having me, John. And it's a 1970 Airstream Ambassador land yacht.
Awesome.
32 feet.
And it's a great little recording studio. It's very cozy in here. I like it a lot. And like I mentioned last time, I talked with Joe about the ospreys that live on his off of his dock, and they're gone now for the fall and will be gone for the winter. But a bird that's here year-round, debatedly, is the Brown-Headed Nuthatch, which is the center of this episode. And Joe has some cool experiences with around his property.
Would you like me to... is that my segue?
Yes, please.
So I've been here for 25 years, and these nuthatches have been as well. Whether it's the same ones, I kind of doubt, because I doubt they live to be 25 years old. But I would think that they're territorial, and they also prefer the same nest spot. In my case, it's an old pile that was part of an old pier that they've been in for at least 20 years that I can remember. I don't remember the very beginning. And they've been going back and forth to that, well, as long as I've been here. And it's also must be a daring first flight for a young bird to look out and you better fly, because all you got is water for at least 100 feet before there's land nearby. And of course, I always see them in the the big pine trees on the property. There's only a handful of them, but they're big, and it's wide open. And it's amazing how nuthatch, he's always on the move. And so he can run down a tree like a squirrel. And he's also chirping. He's like a little busybody all the time. Always moving around.
Yeah, that squeaker toy, doggy squeaker toy noise, you always know that they're there. Yeah, they love your pine trees. They're your loblolly pines. They kind of makes their rounds on it every day. And that nest, I'll be posting a picture of it, but now it's kind of decayed and they don't use it anymore. But it's the sides have decayed and you can see the cavity that they made on the inside. It's pretty impressive. And I can't believe that they did that there, because I mean, really high tides, it has to have flooded and stuff.
No, they're just out of it. Maybe during Isabel, the biggest hurricane about 18 years ago, it might have got close, or at least waves would have lapped up. But that would have been in August, so they would have had vacated it by then.
Yeah, they would have been. Oh, that's interesting. So they made it, but yeah, they kind of. Maybe they even know that, hurricane season, they're done. Of
course they do. These are very smart birds.
Yep. Yeah, Joe, I don't know if you've ever noticed, speaking about how smart they are one of the few birds that will use tools. They'll use twigs, pine needles, pieces of bark as tools to pry out seeds or to tap seeds down to get to bugs. So they are actually pretty smart despite their small size.
Yeah, I always see them eating bugs.
Yep, they like the bugs. That might factor into it, because Joe and I were talking, and I had said that they were year-round, and Joe was like, I don't remember seeing them in the wintertime. So maybe that factors into it. Maybe they come to your yard for the bugs, and then in the winter when there's no bugs, they're at some other places where they're getting out seeds. Yeah,
I would think it's just like in the January, February time frames is where I don't think I see them. But, as we were talking, I can't quite remember because I'm not really looking for them.
Yeah.
Usually, and they're also very friendly. I can be just sitting there in the yard and they have no problem flying up next to you, and they seem to be minding their own business like if you are.
Yep.
And they seem to be very tame, very much like a chickadee.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because you got the white-breasted nuthatch around here also, but I mean, the brown-headed has definitely got its own character. You talk about how you see it hanging upside down and kind of walking every which way. And,
yes.
Yeah, and that makes it really noticeable.
It's the only bird that I know that does that.
Yeah.
He can run on the underside of a branch.
Wow.
You can see him chasing down stuff.
Wow. That's pretty cool. They're chasing down bugs on the trees. That's awesome. And you say you usually only see 2 at a time, but when they have young, you'll see some more. Do you ever notice them, I've read that they do, the cooperative breeding, where, young from a previous year might help them raise another brood. Have you ever noticed anything like that?
I have not.
Gotcha.
I can only remember seeing, 2 at any given time, and not even 3. I'm sure when they have their babies, there are more, but I just haven't noticed it. It's usually the way I see them is when I'm just walking down to the dock.
Yep.
And you go by the big trees, and usually first of all you're going to hear them, and then that gets my attention to start watching them as well. And so I'll stop and pause for a little while and just see what they're up to.
Have you ever noticed them at the bird bath at all, or do they?
I have never seen them get a drink of water or come to a feeder.
Okay.
Including the suet feeders.
Huh. They just like their bugs, I guess.
Well, they don't seem to need people.
Yeah.
Other than maybe the yard, the freshly mowed yard.
The freshly mowed yard, yep. Yeah, we were talking about that, how they like no ground cover. They just like the mature trees, and how people mowing their lawn kind of mimics that forest habitat. And Joe, what is that grass you got out there? The
St. Augustine.
St. Augustine grass, yeah. Which is kind of like a very tough, crabby grass. And
it's salt waterproof.
Yep.
That's why it's out there.
Yep. So yeah, it does, and you got that pretty sandy soil. It does feel like a kind of mature pine forest out in your yard. It's very nice, and yeah, obviously the brown-headeds love it too. Well, cool. Well, Joe, thanks for talking with me. I know that the listeners love hearing you talk about birds. I look forward to having you on some future episodes. Definitely blue heron. And
I got lots of stories on blue herons.
Yep.
You threw me a curve on the nuthatch.
I did.
I thought I knew birds until I met John.
Well, I'm still learning all the time, and I don't have the years and years of experience.
Yeah, mine's observation only.
Yep.
Not much bird study.
Well, that's perfect though. I love the stories. We'll keep them coming for everyone. Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks for letting me hang out in your trailer, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Sure thing. Take care.
It's always great having Joe on the podcast. Take a look at our Instagram and Facebook page to see a picture of that post that he's talking about. It's literally sitting right out in the water, and time has just caused it to kind of rot away and decay, and it's exposed the cavity that the nuthatch has made inside of it. Now, one of the last things I want to touch upon about the brown-headed nuthatch is how it's served as a bellwether species for other animals. Because it prefers these mature pine forests that are increasingly dwindling away in the U.S., its population numbers can reflect upon how other species are doing, such as the red-cockaded woodpecker and Florida panther, that also like mature pine forests. The red-cockaded woodpecker is a pine specialist, and it's declining throughout its range in the southeastern U.S. and classified as an endangered species. Studies have shown that the brown-headed nuthatch will disappear from pine habitats before the red-cockaded. So looking at brown-headed nuthatch populations, seeing how they will do it, can serve as a warning that, oh no, the red-cockaded, these other animals are next. And by helping brown-headed nuthatches, we're helping other species too. Audubon has a great portrait of the brown-headed nuthatch. He shows two of them moving on a pine tree. One of them, kind of the view you usually see, which is from the top. You just see its brown head and then its back. In discussing these birds, he talks a lot about their movement. He writes, "They are mounting, descending, turning in every imaginable position, and with a quickness of motion so much greater than that of most other birds, as to render it extremely difficult to shoot at." Always fucking trying to shoot the birds, aren't you, John James Audubon? Good for you, brown-headed nuthatch. You keep turning around. You keep moving. Dodge those bullets. He also reports that in winter he has seen flocks of 50-plus brown-headed nuthatches together, which I haven't seen any reports like that. Possibly it's just due that the forests were bigger and better in the 1800s and could support big flocks like that. Now, unfortunately, I could not find many myths or legends or anything really about the brown-headed nuthatch specifically. Almost everything seems concentrated around the white-breasted nuthatch, which is much more common, widespread, and flamboyant, so I'm sure most Native Americans kind of focused on that guy. I do have a fun fact. A group of nuthatches is called a jar. I don't know why, but do with that information what you will. I did find one Cherokee legend which talked about how the birds got their names. And I won't go through how every bird got its name in this, but they talk about the nuthatch and say it is called Tsuli Na, which means deaf. And they gave it this name because the nuthatch is fearless and disregards men's presence. Audubon talks about this, and a lot of other writers about the brown-headed nuthatch discuss how it really doesn't have much fear of humans. It's so small and agile, it'll just kind of do whatever it wants, and if you bother it, it'll fly right up to the top of a tall pine tree, start making some squeaking noises at you, and let you know that it ain't happy. Well, that's the end of the episode today. Probably a little bit on the shorter side, but I hope you guys enjoyed hearing Joe talk and enjoyed learning about this little bird. It's definitely really fun to see and hear. I encourage you to find a pine forest within its territory and get a good look at it. Also, visit our Instagram page, visit our Facebook page, send me a listener email at dirtybirdpodcast@gmail.com. Let me know what you think of the show, what kind of birds you want to hear about. Follow Jess at Coastal VA Wild to see more amazing pics of birds around the Gloucester, Virginia area. And as always, stay dirty, my birdies. Now, Pusilla is just Latin for very small, and these are very small. Jeez, what the hell was that? A cannon? God, I got Red Dick the Pirate next door fucking launching off cannons. What the hell? Dirty Bird Podcast is brought to you by me, John, with our rotating panel of guests and co-hosts. Thanks for being on the show, guys. I really appreciate it. Our intro music is by Ricky Pistone, aka Dick Piston. And our outro music is by the Sidewalk Slammers. Check them out wherever you get your music, and also check out our theme song music video on YouTube. Our cover art is done by my beautiful fiancée, Lauren. Thanks for listening. Send any listener mail to dirtybirdpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
At the track, driving to Brooklyn, ain't never coming back. Tim's on the ground in the concrete jungle. I might get into